1978 was a particularly bad year for film archives. Both the National Archives and George Eastman House had their nitrate film vaults catch on fire that year. The fire at the Eastman House destroyed over 300 films, including the original camera negative for the Philadelphia story. When we first start a film restoration, we start with film. So we went and looked for the best film available for the movie. And because the negative wasn't available to us because it was burned in the fire, we had to look at other pieces of film. So we started at Warner Brothers and checked out all the film that they had in their archive, and they were safety film elements, copies of copies or copies made from the original that were not on nitrate stock. What we found was they weren't made very well. They had a sort of doopy quality with not very good grayscale. They were dirty. They just didn't have the quality that these original nitrate negatives and nitrate original preprint materials would have. So Warner Brothers suggested that we contact the George Eastman House because they actually owned safety copies and other copies of the movie. So George Eastman House did have a fine grain made off the original negative that we looked at, and this was really the winning piece of film. Nitrate film fires were very common, and it's one of the problems that face archives all the time. How do they deal with these big nitrate collections? A lot of them have gone up in flames, but they're kept super cool now. They're kept really under the ideal situations, and we now have archives all over the world holding onto nitrate stock that, thank God they do it, because we have these great assets to go back to when we want to remaster films. In the case of Philadelphia Story, if we didn't have this piece of film, you would be seeing something of lesser quality. The only issue with this piece of film was that it had a warping problem. The film is very unstable, and we don't know why that is, but we think it's probably because when the negative was used, it was used many years after the release of the film, and it had shrunk a bit. So when they contact printed this positive copy, it wasn't quite flush up against the blank piece of film that was being recorded to. And that produces this warping sensation that we see and the instability in the film. That's something that you probably don't see when you're watching a print in the movie theater because it's all going on so big and fast and 24 frames a second. But when you watch it in 4K digital, you actually really notice it. And it's something that we had to address.
Typically, we're only dealing with warps on cuts between shots, which happens sometimes because there's a splice in between the two cuts, and once it goes through the scanner, sometimes it bumps. So those are usually pretty easy to fix, and we just do it as we're going along in our typical dirt restoration. But for this film, we're actually doing an entire dewarping pass before we start our normal restoration. So what we're doing is going through shot by shot and looking through each section, seeing how badly it's warped, and we're fixing it kind of section by section. The way dewarping works is you have to find a stable point in the shot that stays the same throughout the shot. So that'll kind of be your anchor frame, and that's the frame you want the rest to look like. So if there's an outdoor scene or there's a lot of clouds in the background, there's not really something to grab onto. Like the things that are really easy to dewarp is anything with a hard edge. We really like door frames, window frames, paintings on the wall, things like that. I picked out this one section in the credits sequence that looks particularly bad to dewarp. And if you see it, you can see the film edges are actually moving up and down. They're kind of waving. And what that looks like on regular play down is just kind of waviness or bumpiness. So in order to fix this, what I'm gonna do is set an in and out point for a section that's about 4 seconds. And I'm gonna take a good frame, one that I like, and I'm gonna set what we call tracking points. So there's something, it's actually pretty easy in the credits section because nothing is changing. So I'm gonna pick some really hard edges out of here and set some of these tracking points. And you can set as many as you want, minimum 3, but the more you have, kind of the better things to grab onto. So that looks good. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna track them. What it's doing now is it's running through that shot with those tracking points I selected, and what it's gonna do is correct that motion in between, that moving up and down, the warping. So hopefully it's gonna get to the end and none of those tracking points will have moved. If they have moved, if a piece of dirt flies in, I have to start over. So I'm just gonna watch it and make sure everything stays stable throughout this. Okay, so now this is fully tracked. So I'm gonna press the render button, and that's gonna render on top of those points the new shot. And now we just wait. And this graph is actually showing the warp. If you see those points going up and down, that's actually the warp. I think we're almost done. So there we go. So I'm gonna play it down now, and hopefully it will look a little bit better. And yeah, it looks a lot more stable. Whereas the film edges before were kind of waving up and down, they're pretty stable now. And what it did was it smoothed out all that warping in between. So that looks a lot better.
After we finished dewarping the entire film, we went ahead and did all the other restoration processes we typically do. That included things like removing dirt and scratches and dust and tears and all the things that we need to remove to make the film look beautiful. We're pretty happy with the result. I don't think you can even tell that there's this warping problem anymore. And underneath this problem is a beautiful piece of film with great grayscale and really shows the photography of Philadelphia Story perfectly.